Good afternoon and happy Friday, everyone. My name is Demetria Caston, and I'm the Executive Director for Impact Austin. On behalf of our community partners, staff, volunteers, and board, I would like to welcome you to Discovery Days 2023. We're glad you're here with us today. Before we begin, I would like to extend a huge thank you to our sponsors. Our title sponsor, FVF Law Injury Attorneys, and our premium sponsor, C2C Media. As many of you may know, I recently joined this wonderful organization earlier this month. The warm welcomes, hugs, and best wishes from both internal and external stakeholders have been much appreciated. Thank you to all of you. What has amazed me the most is the deep passion for our mission from our volunteers. It's undeniable that they're the reason why Impact Austin is able to celebrate 20 years this year of transformative grant making in the Central Texas community. Kudos to all of you. So for those of you who are not aware of who we are, let me step back just a little bit and give you some more information about Impact Austin. We are a collective giving women's philanthropy group open to any individual who identifies as a woman who desires to pool their resources with other community-minded women to make a bigger difference in the lives of others in our community. Our mission is to cultivate and expand the knowledge, passion, and generosity of our members to make a positive impact by developing strong relationships and leveraging the power of collective giving. Our vision is to unlock the potential in our community by uniting to fulfill our philanthropic purpose. Since 2023, Impact Austin members have collectively given over $8.26 million to making 112 grants, serving 91 organizations right here in our Central Texas community in Travis, Williamson, Hayes, and Bastrop counties. Amazing. Every grant cycle, Impact Austin members work together in grant review committees to narrow the applicants to 2 finalists in each focus area. The top vote getter will receive the primary grant, 80% of total dollars collected for that focus area. The other finalists will receive the secondary grant, which is 20% of the total dollars collected based on our annual membership. The grant amounts are now announced at the start of each grant application period. Our 2023 grants will begin with Girls Giving Grants in April, Community and Education in June, and Health and Wellbeing and Equity in November. Currently, our spring grant cycle is open with applications being accepted through Tuesday, February 7th, 2023 until 5 p.m. Central Standard Time. So you still have time to be a part of this upcoming grant cycle. Of course, we cannot do the work that we do without the generosity, commitment, and hearts of our members. While we can count on an average of about 400 members each year to make what we do possible in the community, the needs of our community, a local community, is greater now more than ever. I invite you to visit our website, impactaustin.org, to read more about what we do and how you can be part of the collective giving movement right here in Central Texas. We hope many of you will join us this year moving forward. Feel free to reach out at any time if you have any questions about what we do. With that said, let's jump right into why we're here today. First, a few reminders. You can use the Q&A function to submit your questions, and we will answer them at the end of the session. To react, comment, or pick up resources links throughout the discussion, just see the chat box below. We are also recording today's session, so you'll be able to reference it after today, as our video will be posted on our webpage and shared throughout social media. So please join me in welcoming our panelists, Jerrica Witte and Brenna Cummings. Welcome, ladies, and thank you so much for being Impact Austin members and enlightening us today on impact.
Thanks so much for having us. I think Jerrica is going to get our slide deck going. One moment. Hey, everybody. So we are here to just give a kind of quick conversation training on understanding nonprofit data and impact. You can switch to the next slide. Thanks, Jerrica. A little intro. My name is Brenna Cummings. I have a master's in global policy studies. That's what all those letters are for. From the University of Texas, I went to the LBJ school and focused a lot of my time there on international development, specifically around monitoring data and evaluation. I used to work then in the international development space, transitioned into the technology space where I worked for a case management software company with Jerrica, which is where she and I met. I've since left that space and work as a data delivery manager for a fintech startup, but we both just wanted to bring some of our experiences from the spaces that we worked in and the things that we've learned along the way to talk to you guys about what we've learned that's been valuable around nonprofit data, programs, and outcomes.
Yeah, and as Brenna said, my name is Jerrica Witte. I'm born and raised here in Austin. I have worked in nonprofits and transitioned into tech, and that's how Brenna and I met. We actually developed this training for internal purposes at our shared previous employer to really talk about what is impact, what are outcomes, how do nonprofits go about their day-to-day and collect data to reflect on the effectiveness of their programming and also report on this data. And from our past experiences and then going through the grant review cycle, we thought this would be a helpful conversation to have for not just Impact Austin members, but anyone who's looking to get involved and engage with a nonprofit and wants to better understand how those organizations evaluate the work that they're doing and really kind of peel back some of the layers that go into establishing programs and really monitoring and evaluating their effectiveness.
Yep. So where are we going today? Here's a quick overview. We're going to start real quick with the discussion on what is impact, just to set up the context for the rest of this conversation. And then we'll move into a deeper dive and understanding nonprofit programs, connecting nonprofit programs to data and how they measure outcomes. And then we'll end with a look at how funders fit into this ecosystem and ways we can grow as partners. So to start us off, this is the question of the hour. What is impact? And I think you can measure or define it a bunch of different ways, but my favorite way of defining it that makes the most sense to me, I think, is the measurable change that is the result of an action or service or combination. And impact is really about scale. It really just comes down to scale. So there's different categories of impact depending on the scale of that change. So for example, I would define social impact, the last one on the right here, as the culmination and combination of many different actors creating such a large change that it can be measured at the social level, however you want to define social level. But if you go farther to the left, the words participant outcomes and program outcomes, these are typically what nonprofit programs focus on. These are the outcomes or the measurable change that can be defined and measured at the nonprofit level. So we're going to focus the majority of our conversation today on these first two buckets, not saying that nonprofits don't have a community impact or a social impact. They absolutely do. But for our own conversation here in the space that Jerrica and I have the most experience, we wanted to focus our conversation around participant outcomes, which participants, when we say that word, we're talking about the individuals receiving services or participating in a nonprofit program. And so we're going to spend our time mainly in those two buckets and talk more about how programs are the primary kind of vehicle for service delivery in the ways that nonprofits plan for them, collect data for them, and then report on them as well.
Yeah, and I think that's a really great framework, Brenna. When we were having conversations, we served on two different grant review committees here, and the conversation really came up was, what is impact? Is there a single definition that we can utilize? How do we evaluate the work that these great nonprofits are doing and how they're impacting our community? So I think the thing to keep in mind here, there is no one singular way to say, yes, this is impact, or no, this is absolutely not. It's really about having those conversations and having a baseline shared understanding so that when we're going through this process or determining how we want to engage with other nonprofits, just really having baseline understanding so that we can have more effective, deeper conversations about impact and the work that nonprofits are doing. when we look at those outcomes, these are the things, as Brenna said, that organizations are able to achieve by working through their participants. There's a lot of different types of outcomes, really depending on the types of participants that the organization is serving and how their programs are structured. So we have programmatic outcomes, participant outcomes, near-term outcomes, and long-term outcomes. I don't want to read the slide view here, but there's a lot of different ways that organizations can track and monitor all these different things that they're doing within their programming. With their programmatic outcomes, those are the clearly defined intended benefits that an organization is working towards with their participants. There is no right or wrong option here. A lot of these organizations actually have outcomes in all of these bucketed areas. When we're looking at long-term outcomes, those are typically organizations that are well advanced in what their services they're delivering, how they're tracking and measuring participant progress throughout their time with the organization, and are really well-established organizations that have a lot of internal tools and monitoring available to them. A lot of times the organizations that we're working with, they're more focused on near term, depending on their types of programs and who they're servicing. It doesn't mean it's any less impactful. It's just closer to the time of delivery where we're really looking at how is that program able to impact that individual or their family. Brenna, was there anything you wanted to add here?
I think you nailed it.
Okay, I know outcomes is a very rich area. We could talk for hours about how nonprofits are able to deliver their services and really evaluate not just how their participants are progressing, but also the effectiveness of the programs. So looking at programmatic outcomes is a really great way for organizations to determine if there's any tweaks or changes they want to add to their programs, if they think there's a more effective way of delivering services so they're getting closer to those intended outcomes. And participants, of course, being a person in this world, there's lots of different things that can impact your ability to complete a program with a nonprofit or anything that you're trying to achieve in life. So what are your outcomes? What are the different things that are impacting you as an individual as you're going through programming? What are different items that could sway or determine your intended outcomes? Trying not to use the word impact in every sentence here, but just really wanted to zoom out and look at all the different ways that participants can reach outcomes with a nonprofit.
So moving from here, we wanted to dig into nonprofit programs and really break them down, because I think it's really important for Impact Austin members especially to understand how nonprofits go about not only setting up programs, but how each of these elements fit together. Because when we read grant proposals, a lot of what we're reading without realizing it is one of these elements. And so what you're actually seeing on the screen here is a really basic version of what's called a logic model. Now, logic models are tools that a lot of nonprofits will use. It's a basic tool nonprofits can use to set up how do they expect to get to the programmatic or participant outcome that they want to achieve. And so they start with the inputs. What are the resources that they need to run a program? And then with those resources, what activities will they provide or serve? What will the outputs of those activities be? And then logically, what kind of participant or programmatic outcome or change do they think will happen as a result of a participant participating? That was a lot of the use of that word in their program. And so let me give an example because I find that always helps me. Let's use the example of a workforce development program. So within that, the inputs that they would need would be staff. So salaries for staff, maybe a case management software, the supplies and tools, building, all of the things that they need in order to operate. And I want to call out too that this is where funders are really important, right? We fund the inputs for nonprofits that then draw this relationship between inputs and activities and outputs and outcomes. And so when we read grant proposals, what we want to be looking for is, do we see a compelling and understood relationship between the inputs that they're requesting and the activities and outputs that they would perform and the logical outcomes that they're hoping will happen as a result? So going back to the example, You have a workforce development program. You've got the inputs that they need, the building, the case management software, the salary. Say an activity that they might provide or a service would be providing skills training or reviewing resumes, providing interview prep. Those would be the activities or services. Outputs are just the binary of did the service happen, yes or no? How many people attended the skills training? How many resumes were built or reviews? The number of prep sessions, etc. It's just that, did it happen and how many? And then moving forward, an example of an outcome from that program, a change that would be measurable would be, did somebody gain employment? Did they see an increase in their salary or their wages? Did we see an increase in their proficiency in computer skills? And so we wanted to break down programs to, one, kind of help people understand, how do nonprofits think about them? What are the elements? How do they connect logically? And then how can we as funders think more strategically, proactively about understanding, do we see these elements fitting together? Do we find this program to be compelling? And so on the next slide, we'll talk a little bit more about, for that participant and programmatic outcome piece, how do they measure and report on those? So Jerrica, if you want to skip to the next one.
One thing I wanted to point out here is something that I think is often confused as an outcome would be outputs. A lot of times you'll see numbers and data around how many people are expected to attend an event, which is a great result to see like how far your reach is. But really, when we're pushing for outcomes or impact, what was the result for those 100 people that attended your event? How were they impacted? How was your programming, your services able to get them to a next level towards a goal? And it's one thing that I know I've had conversations around this a lot, where like the output, how many number of people served, is different from the outcome or the impact. And that's something that we as funders can also push for when reviewing grants and requesting information about the intended programming, is going beyond just the reach, but what is the actual effect of those services in that program?
Exactly. And so this is my favorite thing to talk about because it's data, but I wanted to zoom a little bit out. Jerrica's laughing at me because she knows it's true. I wanted to zoom out though real quick and talk about why in general do nonprofits collect data, because there are different reasons and they depend on the purpose, the audience, their reporting requirements, etc. And so if a nonprofit's collecting data, I don't want us to just assume it's for one reason or another. We need to understand what they're collecting it for, how they're going about that. So the first kind of primary, and by the way, these are not exhaustive. There's always more nuance. Practitioners and nonprofits are the experts here and could give us a million more examples. But in my experience, these are kind of the three buckets that I've seen the most. And the first one, the one we're probably most familiar with, is that donor and funder requirements. So the data that they collect is really going to be about answering the question of, what does my grant or my donor require in response for receiving that funding. And by the way, donors don't always realize it, but we don't always ask for outcome related data. Sometimes we only want data around the things that we care about. So maybe population served or number of people or outputs. So it's good to understand that just because it's a donor or funder requirement doesn't necessarily mean it's impact or outcome related. That second bucket, program monitoring, this is really about answering, is my program being delivered as I planned? As a nonprofit, can I monitor the rollout of the services that we're providing? And this is really going to look at those inputs, activities, and outputs. Did we serve the number of people we set out to serve? Did we do the number of services which we planned for, etc.? And then finally, program evaluation. And so this is about answering that question around, is my program delivering that intended benefit or outcome or change? All three of those words really mean the same thing here. And outcomes are going to be captured within evaluation data. And in order to have evaluation data, you really have to plan in a specific way. And you have to plan a program as well as your data collection methodology in order to be able to capture that data for evaluation. Jerrica, anything you wanted to add here?
Yeah, we're good.
All right. And then lastly, hopefully your eyes aren't glazing over at this point as we talk about the nitty-gritty of data, but I think it's important to understand a little bit deeper around how do nonprofits measure outcomes. And the key to this truly is data collection and planning. And I wanted to show you guys three of like the primary data collection tools that I've seen and or used myself to measure that change or outcome. So the first one that nonprofits can use are assessments. And these are really just a way to evaluate progress towards a goal. They are used to measure or assess a person or a population at a point in time. And a lot of times you'll use them at the beginning or end. Really common assessments would be a baseline or an end line. So going back to our workforce development example, you could use a baseline assessment to measure where a participant's maybe wage or salary is, where their proficiency in computer skills are. And then you could use an end line assessment at the end of a program to measure, did we see a change in their wage? Did we see a change in their proficiency? Surveys are another type of data collection instruments that are used to collect data from a population of people to be able to get their own perspective of progress. And this kind of goes back to what Jerrica mentioned around participant outcomes. People are individuals and they're different, and sometimes they may achieve the intended programmatic outcome, or maybe they don't, but they might achieve their own individual participant outcome. And surveys are really helpful in collecting participant perspective and views and experience. So for example, going back to our workforce development, you could use a survey every year to measure, is a participant's reported satisfaction with the program that they went through? Do they have changes that they might make or ways to do the program better that a nonprofit could use to kind of reevaluate their services? And then lastly, indicators. This is a way it's a measure of a concept. And so I think indicators are probably the most common way of going about measuring an outcome. I think the best example I have is kindergarten readiness, right? We say you've got and I know I'm switching examples here, but say the outcome you want to measure is you want to see an increase in kindergarten readiness. Well, what does kindergarten readiness actually mean? How do we measure that? You would measure it through indicators like reading comprehension scores, emotional independence, or however else you want to make up that concept. So each of these three are, once again, not exhaustive, but they're three different ways that nonprofits can go about planning and collecting data in order to measure change in the people that they're providing services for. And I think it's helpful for us when we are doing grant review committees or just as Impact Austin members to understand that, one, when we see these words, we understand a little bit more about what nonprofits are doing with them. But also, if we don't see them doing these things, that doesn't necessarily mean they're not measuring outcomes. It may be a signal that we need to dig deeper and ask better questions of that nonprofit.
Yeah, absolutely. And they can use, any combination of ways to measure this outcome, depending again on what's influencing them to collect data. So if it is something for a funder, especially if it's a government-related funder, a lot of times there are assessments that they have that are based on very prescriptive measures for that funder requirement. If they're utilizing surveys, it may be because they have a hypothesis about changes to a program that they want to implement, but they want to get information from their participants about those experiences. So again, we're not saying one's better than the other, one's right or wrong. These are just different ways and elements that organizations can collect and track participant progress as they are moving towards outcomes. And as we all know, there's a lot of challenges that nonprofits face, and specifically when we're talking about data collection towards outcomes and impacts, there's some that I wanted to call out that are oftentimes not top of mind when we're reviewing grant applications. And when we're looking at organizations and measuring their impact, it's not a straightforward apples to apples comparison based on where the organization is in their life cycle, who they're targeting to serve as their participants. A lot of different factors can impact how they are able to present and tell their story through data. One of those challenges can be organizational capacity. As an organization grows and matures, they're able to retain staff, hire additional full-time staff, move from a volunteer model to a staff model, are able to attract board members who are able to bring in influence, potential funder opportunities, and all of that impacts an organization's ability to deliver services and also track and monitor the programs that they are running. Technology is huge in this space. For an organization to establish a really reliable technology stack is a very time-consuming and even expensive process. When you're thinking about the technology that you need to deliver your programs and collect data, there's so many different factors that go into play here. What systems do you need? What software is available to you that will actually capture data that's important to you and the data that's important to your funders. Looking at your actual hardware. Does your computer have the ability to run those systems? Who's going to train people once we select what program we want to go with? If you have participants that you're meeting off-site, outside of your location, does it need to be mobile friendly and actually be able to access from maybe a phone or a tablet so they can bring data collection options to their participants? This is a very long process, and there are consultants that can help organizations dig through this. But if you're not yet at a place where you can afford to bring outside help, it is a very daunting task. In my previous job working in software, I saw someone who is an executive director or director of programming really trying to learn a lot in order to understand what are the questions they need to ask to evaluate a technology solution. So that's another challenge for organizations that they work through, but depending on where they are in their maturity, can be a struggle to help determine what is the right path forward for them. And equity, which the second session of Discovery Days will dive in deeper, but I didn't want to forget or leave out the conversation of equity. There's so many things that impact organizations around this subject, whether it's who gets to determine what impact actually is. Is it the funder? Is it the participants? Is it a combination where staff is pulling, trying to balance really the needs of their participants along with the requirements of a funder? Organizations that are serving populations that have historically had limited access to funding or outside support, it can be really challenging for organizations to balance all of these things, but it's something that we need to think about when we're reviewing grant applications and also determining how we want to engage and support organizations. Anything to add here, Brenna?
No, I think that was perfect.
Okay. And something that I touched on a lot in this slide was talking about the maturity of an organization. So I wanted to quickly show an example of a nonprofit life cycle. It's very common to the cycle that you see with any company or any contingent of people coming together for a purpose, where there's peaks and valleys, there's growth, there's a lot of things happening that are establishing all the necessary resources or inputs that you would need to be successful in this space. It typically starts with an idea when you have a real spark to establish something, an organization that's going to achieve and accomplish a mission. There's a startup phase where you're starting to formalize governance, being able to track and start marketing. You have very limited financial resources typically in this period, and you're starting to look for board members and others who are able to participate in your idea to actually lead towards execution. There's that growth stage where you have more consistent delivery in your programming. You're typically hiring on additional staff members here, or you could still be relying on volunteers, but they have an increased amount of responsibility in that organization. Also during growth, you are looking to diversify your funding sources. So if you have one main donor, you start looking for other opportunities, whether that's through grants or fundraising activities that you can do within the organization. And again, all of this impacts how organizations are able to tell their story through data. So when we're looking at that last slide, something like technology, you may not have advanced software to really track and tell stories with data when you're early on. That may not be something you reach until growth or maturity of your organization. And that's something for us to keep in mind as well when we're looking at nonprofits. Just because someone is in a later stage doesn't mean they're any more deserving or more impactful than another organization that is near startup or growth. It's just a way to kind of understand where organizations are coming from, what they have the capability to do. And as Brenna said earlier, if they're not doing an activity, it doesn't mean that they don't want to, or there's not a desire for it. They may not have the personnel to execute it. They may not have someone like Brenna on their team who has experience with logic models that can really deeply look at the formation of programming and think ahead of what we need in the future to be able to report on. It is a process that all organizations go through to really get to a place of maturity where they can present and tell stories about their work and their participants through data. So I think a big point of focus when we were thinking about this presentation was really how can we as funders be better participants in the nonprofit ecosystem? And I think the first thing is just realize that we are part of this ecosystem, and we have a great opportunity to have a lot of influence on what organizations do, and that is a privilege. And that's something that we shouldn't take lightly as funders, and something that and I think Impact Austin does a really good job of, is being partners with those that we fund, and being able to be a resource for ideas, inspiration, and volunteers. Things that we can do is really learn about the nonprofit, understand the mission of the organization, and also that history. How has it evolved over time? Where is that organization in their life cycle? That's something that you can ask them to evaluate for themselves, and also something for us to think about as we're reviewing the history of these organizations. And I think this is something we do really well through our grant review cycle, really digging deep and doing some background research and asking for this information up front to really understand the organization, its goals, and where they are currently and where they've been. Learning about the participants. Organizations are structured to provide services for individuals or families to get from point A to point B. Do we know about the populations that they're serving? Are there certain things that are happening in the government, different policies or laws that are impacting this population? Do we understand the voice of those participants? Is that something that the organization helps to provide testimonials and stories about that population, and really getting close to those problems, especially if it is a population or a service area that we don't have personal experience in? Asking questions and getting closer and understanding what are the challenges that these participants are facing? What are items that we may not know about that would teach us more about maybe some of the struggles that the organization has just to deliver those services? So it's really important to not lose sight of the individuals and families that these organizations are working so tirelessly to serve. And then reviewing your funder requirements. As we've talked about a couple of times here, something I hope you walk away with is funders do have the ability to really influence the work that nonprofits are able to do and where they spend their time and energy. So making sure that the requirements that we're requesting aren't adding an undue burden to these organizations that are receiving grants. If we are looking towards impact, making sure that the things that we're asking for align with impact, so it's really easy to see how the organization was able to utilize those funds to drive programming for their participants. It's possible for organizations to be turned off by requirements of a funder. I know Brenna, when we were establishing this example, she worked with an organization where they chose not to go after certain funding because the requirements of the funder were so robust and not important to their participants and the outcomes that they are working towards, that it didn't make sense for them to spend all this time and energy to work towards the goal of a funder versus the goal of their actual programming. So just being mindful of the things that we're asking organizations to turn around and report on, because it does take time, money, and resources to be able to provide those reports, is really important as an organization. Anything to add here, Brenna?
I think just to reiterate one more time that program evaluation, nonprofit evaluation really does require funding, and it requires resources, education, salary, staff. And so that it can't be something that funders, and I'm not necessarily saying Impact Austin here, but funders in general, we can't just expect them to have evaluation in place if we aren't also willing to provide the resourcing for it. And so just wanting to add some like nuance and a different dynamic to that conversation. It's not just we give funding and we get data back, but there's actually a way for us to partner with them to be able to fund that. There are also funders now looking more towards actually only funding evaluation capacity, and I think that's great. But just wanted to call that out one more time, that it requires funding, it requires resources, and nonprofits are already doing so much with so little. So
yeah. And that is the end of our presentation. If we have any questions, we can transition to that.
Thank you so much, ladies, for this wonderfully informative presentation. I'm pretty sure all of us gathered some really great information for our efforts moving forward. We appreciate you as Impact Austin members and as well as advocates in the community for all we do. We have a couple of questions, so I am going to jump right into them. To all of our attendees, please drop your questions in the chat, and Brenna and Jerrica would be more than happy to answer those for you. The first one that I see is, what is the most effective and ethical way to conduct surveys if your nonprofit is serving underserved communities?
That's a great question. Jerrica, do you have any thoughts? I can give my perspective if that would help to start us off.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I think so. One, I think that's a great question to ask, and I want to be mindful here and make sure that Jerrica and I are not experts in this space in that way exactly. And so I don't actually want to answer the ethical piece for you, because I think there are experts out there that could do a much better job. I think in terms of effective, how effective can you be? This is where the role of technology can be really helpful. This is where digital data collection. But I think really going back to that question around conducting surveys, I think it just depends on the population you're serving, the goals of what you're trying to collect, what you're trying to measure, and then forming a data collection plan around that in a way that respects the privacy and dignity of the individuals that you're collecting that data from, as well as hopefully using technology, because technology really is a game changer for digital data collection. That would be my perspective, and I do want to caveat all that with the ethical piece. There are so many experts out there, I think, that could do a much deeper and better job answering that piece. So I don't want to answer that one.
Only thing I would add to that is surveys are important and critical. If we don't have that baseline, if we don't have information from the participants themselves, you're really doing a disservice to your organization. So the fact that you're already thinking about, I need to do this in an ethical manner, is putting you head and shoulders above a lot of different organizations. So I think one thing that's really important, especially when working with really any population, is having a very secure data management tool. If you're wanting to do surveys on paper, to make sure that it's equitable, if you don't have participants who have access to technology, that is totally fine, but transferring that data into a very secure system, not just having it like in Excel or any tools that could be just, you don't want data to get into the wrong hands, is something that I think is really important. And I think it's also really smart to look at the design of your survey questions and make sure that they're not leading and that they're open enough for participants to really provide their true perspective of their current situation or of their opinion of the services that you're providing.
Anything else to add for that question? That was a great answer from both of you. I have another question. Impact Austin is learning more and more about trust-based philanthropy, which often involves providing unrestricted support to a nonprofit. What can or should a funder expect in terms of reporting?
That's a great question. Jerrica, do you want to take it, or you want me to start?
I want you to take it, because we talk about this a lot. I think you're really passionate about truth-based philanthropy and have a little bit more background.
Definitely. So I think one of the tenets of trust-based philanthropy that I really appreciate is actually the partnership piece between funder and nonprofit. It's trusting the nonprofit to be the expert in their space, but it's also creating a relationship and a partnership that allows more of a conversation around how is the nonprofit using those funds, and then how can that nonprofit measure outcomes to report back. And so I don't want to necessarily set an expectation or give you I don't know if there's a direct way to answer, like, here's exactly what you should expect. But I think it really should be about fostering partnership and communication between what is reasonable for the nonprofit to do with the funds that you're providing, and what data collection and data reporting would fit reasonably within that as well. And hopefully within that, there is some outcome measurement, but that once again depends on the funding, the evaluation resources that nonprofit has. But I think trust-based philanthropy, it also, I think, depends on who you ask, how they define it, but I really do think the partnership piece is really important. It's taking that power dynamic between funder and nonprofit and evening it to more of a partnership, trying to achieve the outcome that they both agree on.
Exactly. It's a collaborative effort. So really understanding what the organization needs to do that's important to them and how you can align with what you need as a funder to match the organization. So it's not additional work, but it's something that they need to do and want to do as an organization to be able to represent the progress that they're making with their participants. So it really is a collaboration, and that's something that you can establish early on before giving the funds.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And now that I know that Brenna has a passion for trust-based philanthropy, as Impact Austin continues to lean more into that space and commit to trust-based philanthropy, I hope you don't mind if we reach out to you just to pick your brain just a little bit more.
Brenna, say yes.
Oh, I'm nodding. Sorry. Yes.
Let's see. We have a couple other questions. When collecting data, confidentiality and gaining informed consent. I actually think that's a comment and not a question. Oh, did you hear me? That was actually a comment and not a question. Mm-hmm. Can you discuss how Impact Austin is measuring impact, and in particular, participant and programmatic outcomes?
That is a great question. And I think, I don't actually know if we're the right people to answer that. I know that Impact Austin has a logic model, but Demetria, I think I'll leave that one to you all.
Hold on. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Hello, hello.
Uh-oh, internet issues. Demetria, we can hear and see you if you can hear and see us. Oh, she's breaking up.
Spinning.
Yeah, I think while Demetria's internet reloads, I think we would let the Impact Austin staff and Nicole and Demetria answer that question. If she can't reload, she can follow up.
Yeah, I can help answer a piece of that question. As Brenna mentioned, Impact Austin does have a logic model that we've created actually in partnership with the UT graduate student. And that's the first time in our history that we've done that, sort of really thinking through what our inputs and outputs are and how we're thinking about measuring impact's own impact. So that is something that we're working on being more transparent about with our community partners and with the community. So that's a work in progress as we're kind of doing the same process that Jerrica and Brenna were talking about how we collect data and being mindful of all of those things. So we're working through that process now. But one of the things I can add is, from a funder perspective, what we ask at the end of from our grantees, and sort of bring that perspective, which I think could be helpful. On our grantees, the final report, we have 4 questions that we ask our partners to share about the impact that their grant had. And so one of the questions directly that we ask of our grantees is, what impact did Impact Austin's grant have on your organization, collaborative, the community, and the target population? And so we asked them to describe in their own words what that impact or outcomes looked like. So we collect that information from our grantees and in turn report that out to the community as a way just to show the work that our community partners are doing along that journey, but also just after that, we really consider our grantees to be partners. I know that has been something that y'all have talked about today, and really continuing to show the work that they've done with that grant, but also outside of that grant and moving forward for the organization. So I think that's one piece. There's a lot more that we can unpack, and hopefully more we can report out in the coming years as Impact Austin works through their trust-based philanthropy and also our own logic model to see where we ourselves can have an impact in our members. So looking forward to sharing that as we continue on that journey. And I think Demetria might be back also. Oh.
I am. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
I'm so sorry. I had a big old spinning kind of thingy going on here. Nicole, did you get through the question? I actually don't have any of the questions on my screen since I logged out and in. So if there's any questions, would you mind presenting those questions to Jerrica and Brenna? Since I can no longer see
those are
them.
the only questions that we have so far. So I think that looks like we have just a little bit of time left. If there's, I just open it up to you, Jerrica and Brenna. Are there final thoughts that maybe you might share based on some of the questions that have come in, or other thoughts that you've had during the presentation before we sign off for the day?
I love the questions. I think they're creative and strategic and exactly the questions we should be asking. And I would encourage us. I would think about this presentation as like if we were talking about nonprofit data impact as a book, what Jerrica and I have tried to do is basically give you the introduction. Like, here's just a brief, quick summary prologue. And the nonprofit partners and program evaluator practitioners, they will be able to give us much more depth and nuance and example and actually be able to fill in the chapters. So I know Impact Austin is going to continue doing discovery days, but I also hope that we can continue to have people to come in that are deep experts and practitioners in this space to share the complexity that they work in every day so that we can understand more deeply how are nonprofits operating, how is the data that we're seeing being collected and evaluated, and where are the spaces that funders can play a more collaborative role in this space.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is data is powerful and it can really help organizations pinpoint areas of need that they may not be thinking of, ways that they can change and transition their programming to better serve their participants. But it doesn't have to be, or I at least hope, it's not a such a hard determinant of whether an organization is worthy of funding and support, because it does take a lot of funds, technology, people, resources, and partners to get to a place where you can beautifully explain, your 50-year history through data and different modeling of your programming. And I think we have a really powerful influence to help organizations get to that piece and give them opportunities to pursue additional programming through the funds that we provide and ask really important questions of them. So if it's not something that they're thinking about top of mind, if they're in that really early part of that organizational maturity, it's something that they are mindful to build in later. So I love data, it's very helpful, but I don't want it to be something that is a stopper in us being able to partner with an organization. I think it's something that comes along in that maturity, and as a really reputable funding source in this community, we can have a great impact on how people think about data in their organizations.
Thank you to both of you once again. Just a reminder for everyone to save the date for our next Discovery Day session. Will be on Friday, February 10th at noon. So we hope that you will make plans to join us. Thank you all for staying curious, staying informed, and for doing all you do for our community. Have a wonderful Friday and weekend. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Yeah.